Summary is that relying heavily on the handouts and selected pages in She and Sing and a little bit in Read, which I will continue to do today, I covered efforts during the late 1980s and then in the early 1990s to get the middle class deeply involved in the efforts for health reform. There was strong motivation for that to happen. I recreated some of the circumstances that motivated the middle class to be involved, explained that an important event was an election to fill a vacated senatorial seat in Pennsylvania. The candidate who won was a largely unknown Democrat, a man by the name of Harris Wofford, who ran against a very well-known Republican who in fact had previously been governor of the state of Pennsylvania, and yet he won on essentially a single-issue campaign of the concerns of the middle class for health reform. There had long been concerns about health reform for those who were underserved, who were poor, those who would be served by the Medicare and Medicaid legislation. But this was something new. When the middle class realized that it was hurting and it was getting squeezed, and so there was a broader coalition in support of health care reform. Bill Clinton ran with that as a very high priority in his campaign. After the economy, health care reform was his second most important issue. And after he was inaugurated in January of 1993, he was elected in November 92, he began a very important push to get health reform done. Created a commission. Hillary Clinton was the titular head of the commission. There were really some major policy people behind her, but she was the public face of the commission, was the voice of the commission. And long story short, those efforts failed utterly, even when legislation was introduced in September 1992. The measure never really came to a vote in Congress because of the political conflicts surrounding it and the poor judgment that was exemplified by some of Clinton's advisors, including Hillary Clinton herself, making some foolish mistakes. In any case, there were two people around who were eyewitnesses to the Clinton failure, and they were the Emanuel brothers. One was Ron Emanuel, or Ram I think it is with an M, and the other was Ezekiel Emanuel. Ezekiel, as physician, was at Harvard, came down to DC as a presidential fellow, saw what was going on, and observed a number of the blunders, policy blunders and political blunders. His younger brother, Rahm Emanuel, watched what was going on, paid particular attention to the political events and political strategies, kept that in mind. They are both very well known and still influential today. Ezekiel has a distinguished professorship at the University of Pennsylvania, both in medical school and elsewhere. He is a leading voice on health policy and medical ethics. He's often published in the New York Times and other places, in addition to more specialized policy journals. Ron Emanuel is currently the mayor of Chicago, where he plays his rough and tumble game of politics to the hilt. In between, both had crucial roles in the Obama administration, and both were critical to the successful passage, though by a squeaking margin of nearly 5 votes, in the House of Representatives. As pointed out by Sheen Singh, 217 to 212, there was not a vote to spare. They were centrally involved. Ezekiel as essentially the principal health policy advisor to the Emanuel administration. There were lots of other people who had their oars in, but it was Ezekiel who was had greatest access to the president and helped shape policy initiatives and the strategy of the Affordable Care Act. Rahm Emanuel was, in the beginning of Obama's administration, chief of staff. He held that position for a couple of years before he decided to go back to Chicago and make his bid for the Chicago mayoralty position, which he did successfully get. He was a very tough chief of staff. He had been in the House of Representatives before that. He had built a reputation as a real political infighter, a guy who would just push people around and use the full authority that he had. used brutal tactics. People sort of gave the impression that if he could catch you in a dark alley and beat you up with brass knuckles on his fingers, he would do that. He certainly did the political equivalent of that. So one of the lessons he learned by watching the failures of the Clinton efforts was that the Democrats were wildly divided. There was no unanimity among the Democrats. Emanuel made the commitment, we will not repeat that mistake again. And even though I have to beat the crap out of you, you're going to be in line. And so 217 Democrats who could vote for the bill voted for the bill. That was it. Emanuel style, having learned the lesson and adapted it to his own personality and style. Ezekiel Emanuel, working at a much higher level of planning and theory and health policy, saw some of the failed efforts and confusions built into the Clinton proposal and guided Obama to support a measure that would be much more acceptable to key players in the health arena, which he understood very, very well. So that's a quick summary of my basic points from last Wednesday's lecture. The other was to look rather quickly at efforts during the Bush administration from about 2000 to 2008 to do something, make some gestures to health reform. It wasn't very impressive, and it was late in the game. When Gore ran against Bush and actually won the election, it was stolen from him and given to him by the Supreme Court, the famous decision about hanging chads and supposedly defective ballots in Florida. In any case, when Gore graciously accepted that horrific moment in our recent history and Bush became president, Gore had run on a campaign in which he was strongly advocating health reform of various kinds. He was very interested in getting a pharmaceutical benefit built into Medicare. He was very interested in beginning the push to universal health reform by allowing certain cohorts to buy into Medicare, starting with those from 55 to 64, and suggesting that if that is accomplished, we can then work our way down the demographics and gradually achieve a single payer for all, Medicare for all system. He did not win the election, and Bush largely ignored health reform in the early years of his campaign. We know that 9/11 happened. We know that there were wars in the Middle East that were loosely related to the 9/11 event, including maybe the attack on Afghanistan had some merit, if that's in fact where Al-Qaeda hung out at that time. The assault in Iraq, the Iraqi war, had very little justification, but was pushed anyway on some rather trumped up information. In any case, those were the preoccupations of the early Bush administration, and only in 2003, as the election of 2004 re-election bid began to loom large. And though he didn't know that Gore would run again, he didn't. He feared that he might, and he had to try to beat him off at the pass. And since Gore had made a big issue of health reform in his campaign, then Bush was going to do something about health reform. He got into that with the Medical Modernization Act of 2003 that gave us Medicare Part D, which was a real giveaway, a boondoggle for the pharmaceutical industry. It was resisted by some leaders of the Republican Party, by the Democrats. Nonetheless, it passed, and it turned out to be, in its early years, a rather controversial piece of legislation. Some of the problems with it were only amended and improved during the Obama administration as part of the Affordable Care Act, but that's jumping a little bit ahead. Another very major event having to do with health policy in the Bush administration was his veto of a legislative effort to extend S-chip, which was one of the measures passed in the second of Clinton's term in 1997, state-based children's health insurance program that covered lots of kids who would not otherwise have health insurance. There was an effort to extend that. There was a time period when it would no longer be effective. And though there was bipartisan support for the extension, Bush vetoed it, believing, or at least claiming to believe, those claims by the private insurance industry that extending S-chip would in fact hurt their financial bottom line. even though there was no real effort that the kids who were covered by SCHIP would have been covered by any commercial policies, that anyone could afford them. So that's where things stood until the Obama administration came in after that successful election in 2008, in which health care figured significantly. The Republican candidate at the time, John McCain, developed a plan of his own, which really recycled many older Republican ideas that had been around for quite some while. Obama won, and the push began very soon after his inauguration, in this case in January 2009, for what became the Affordable Care Act. It was a major battle of over a year, and we will get to some of the features of that. But before we get to that, I want to point out that there were very significant developments in the early 2000s in health reform. Not in the White House, and not much in Congress, though there were some efforts in Congress, as we'll see, that played a very important role in shaping the climate and the environment into which the efforts for the Affordable Care Act fit, and help explain why the Affordable Care Act took some of the features it did. It wasn't just that these two key eyewitnesses, the Emanuel brothers, were around. They played into a larger environment, a larger set of forces. So to get a sense of what was going on in the early 2000s, outside of the presidential office and much of Congress, take a look at the first page of this handout, which has H.R. 676 on the first page. H.R. 676 is a bill which has not yet received a majority. There are newer versions of H.R. 676 which have been introduced in the most recent sessions of Congress. The H.R. 676 bill is a bill which advocates, which lays out the creation of a Medicare for all, a single-payer system for the United States. And as you can see on the bottom, it would be a bill to provide for comprehensive health insurance coverage for all U.S. residents, etc., etc. And it was a Medicare for all model, getting back to the advocacy of the late 60s, when Teddy Kennedy picked up the baton and tried to get the country to adopt a Medicare for all proposal, which carried to the 70s and then died out. One of the things that was interesting about this effort in the early 2000s to move towards a Medicare for all proposal is that there was a lot of support for it around the country. And I'll just give you a couple of pieces of evidence to back up the claim that there was a lot of support for it. That it was not a loud, cuckoo, crazy idea in many people's perceptions. Look at page 2 of the handout, which is a resolution adopted by the City Council of Chicago on June 13th, 2007. H.R. 676, this version of it had been introduced earlier in that year, in 2007. And those who were advocating for single payer, primarily an organization called PNHP, Physicians for a National Health Program, which had first begun with a very small number of devoted members in the late 1980s, grew during the 1990s, and by the early 2000s was a growing and very influential organization of leading physicians from leading medical schools who were promoting this single-payer idea. One of the things they did was reach out to various city governments and went to the national meeting of mayors of cities, where that national meeting, don't know the official name of it, but the Association of All Mayors of Major Cities, passed a resolution at its national meeting in 2007 endorsing H.R. 676 and urging, since the cities didn't have direct representatives as such in Congress, urging their states' congressional delegations, and especially those members of the state delegations who represented city districts, to also support H.R. 676. So here is one sample resolution that was passed, and if you go to the bottom left column after all the other whereases, Here's whereas HR 676 would cover all medically necessary services without financial barriers, et cetera, et cetera. Top of the right column, whereas 6 members of Illinois' congressional delegation are already co-sponsors of HR 676, now therefore be it resolved that we, the mayor and the members of the Chicago City Council, on this date, do hereby support and endorse the United States National Health Insurance Act, HR 676, and do hereby call upon the Illinois congressional delegation to support this bill. Signed by Mayor Daley, etc. This was an example of the kind of building campaign around the country for HR 676 at the local level. If you turn over to page 3, you have the evidence of polls that were conducted in this same period, which are pretty dramatic in their consistency and in what they indicate about popular views. This is polling the public, not filtering through politicians who are subject, of course, to various pressures and special interest lobbying and so on. Just some examples. In October 2003, the Washington Post and ABC collaborated on a news poll and asked people, which would you prefer, the current health insurance system in the United States or a universal health insurance program in which everyone is covered under a program like Medicare that's run by the government and financed by taxpayers. 62% of those polled opted for that plan, Medicare for all. Drop down to another poll, February 2007, New York Times CBS poll. Do you think the federal government should guarantee health insurance for all Americans, or isn't this the responsibility of the federal government? 64% of those polled, essentially 2/3, said it was the responsibility of the U.S. government and the federal government should guarantee that right of access. A May 2007 CNN opinion research poll was posed this question: do you think the government should provide a national health insurance program even if this would require higher taxes? We are told repeatedly that Americans draw the line, higher taxes, no, we don't want it. Even if it would require higher taxes, do you want it or not? 64% said yes, only 35% said no. And then the last poll, December 2007, the AP, Associated Press, and Yahoo collaborated on a poll which would come closest to your view that the United States should continue the current insurance system in which most people get their health insurance through private employers, etc., or the United States should adopt the universal health insurance program, which everyone's covered under a program like Medicare, run by the government and financed by the taxpayers. 65% said it should be the latter, that the United States government should run the program, should be like Medicare, should be financed by taxpayers, and only 34% believe that the program should continue. This was a pretty consistent set of polls that demonstrated how popular single-payer Medicare for all had become. Turn to page 4, and you'll see a group of smiling Chicagoans who were supporting single-payer. On the left is Dr. Quentin Young, who was a mainstay of principal strategist with Physicians for a National Health Program. He was a great and respected figure in Chicago medicine. He had run the Department of Medicine at the beleaguered but constantly struggling Cook County Hospital, where he delivered health care to the poorest of Chicago citizens. Next to him is Linda Ray Murray, who is a very outspoken leading Chicago physician and industrial health expert. Next to her is her protege, Claudia Fagan, also a physician, and both all three of those, Quentin Young, Linda Ray Murray, and Claudia Fagan had all at various times been president of the Physicians for a National Health Program, that is a single-payer advocacy group. And then next to them is this tall, smiling state senator in Illinois, who was a Chicagoan and a friend of these guys, who was a strong single-payer advocate. That's right, Barack Obama. And there is not only photographic evidence, there is clear written evidence that in the early 2000s, Obama, like other people in Chicago, was a strong supporter of single-payer initiatives. But single-payer obviously threatens a lot of special interests, and the cartoonist captures it beautifully and succinctly on page 5 of the handout. There you see on the left the voices of Americans rising as expressed in those 65 and 66 and 64% favorable ratings for single payer. There, the voice of the grassroots, a single payer, universal, public funded national health plan will save billions of dollars and offer preventive medicine, et cetera, et cetera. We would gain, we would win, we would save, yes, but who would lose? Those guys on the right. Insurance industry, drug firms, the hospitals that were for-profit, whether they were ostensibly so or not, but made big profits and had big black bottom lines, etc., they would lose. So forget about it. Forget about it. And page 6, we see some of the way that was implemented. As this rising tide of popular sentiment was getting more and more threatening to some of the vested interests, a strange entity called the Healthcare Coalition for the Uninsured was created. It called itself the Coalition of Strange Bedfellows, because if you look down that list, this is only a partial list, but it represents the most significant members of the HCCU, as it was called, the Healthcare Coalition for the Uninsured. You range from AARP, generally thought of as liberal, the American Public Health Association, generally thought of as liberal, but in the same organization with the AMA, now the AMA was in transition, but it was still the AMA, American Hospital Association, and no doubt about it, Americans Health Insurance Plans Incorporated, as the trade group for the insurance industry. And for-profit players in the medical, pharmaceutical, device, etc. industry, Johnson & Johnson, New Brunswick, New Jersey, Pfizer, major drug conglomerate, International Drug Power, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which was almost always towards the right politically and had strongly opposed Medicare during the 60s and so on. These strange bedfellows formed a coalition that realized that there was this rising tide of support for dramatic health reform and were clearly threatened by the prospect of a Medicare for All program. And so they met together, came up with proposals that made clear how little they valued a single payer for all proposal. They issued 18 proposals, as you can see on page 7, starting with rather modest proposals like tax credits for individuals and families while leaving everything else intact. That was essentially the campaign of the Republicans opposing Clinton in the early 90s. It was McCain's campaign, the centerpiece of his health policy when he ran against Obama, or tax credits for employers, expand Medicaid, expand S-chip, that's okay. Maybe adopt an employer mandate, which had been frequently discussed since the Nixon years in the 1970s, pay or play, play or pay. That is, the employer either covers all of his workers or he pays into a special fund that will help finance a public option alternative. So you either play by providing insurance or you pay, and the money you pay into this fund helps provide your workers who would otherwise not be covered. Or you have an individual mandate, a very controversial idea recently, but actually first introduced by the Heritage Foundation, a right-wing think tank in the late 1980s that proposed that as an alternative to the Clinton plan. It was back again in this form. Insurance market reforms, high-risk pools, and 18 of 18 possibilities, presumably the last to be considered, the least favored by this coalition, a single-payer national health plan. If asked, they could claim, oh, we put it on our list, but in our discussions and deliberations, it just didn't get that high a priority score. Whatever. It was clear that they were aiming to deflect attention and support for single-payer national health reform. They had heard the message that the American public wanted health reform, but these other 17 alternatives, or some combination of them, should be the way to go. They would be less threatening to established interests, they may even, if designed correctly, actually help and support those established interests. So, what was the overall outcome of all that? Well, we can see it on page 8 of the handout in 6 panels of this very, very clever cartoon. There's Obama on the left trying to chisel, that is, sculpt health reform, and he is being confronted by the Republican elephant and the blue dog Democrat. Those what those symbols mean. Blue dog Democrats were the more conservative Democrats who, in most of their policies, were consistent with mainstream Republicans rather than with liberal Democrats. So the Democrats were still divided. They say, lose single payer. And so Barack, who had supported it, as we saw in that photograph, and there's other evidence, said, okay, I'll lose single payer. Medicare expansion, maybe by buy-in, by cohorts, nah, lose that. And Obama said, okay, lose that. Well, what about a public option as one of the options that will be put into the various marketplaces? We haven't gotten to the structure of the Affordable Care Act yet, but it'll become clear. Cut the public option. He lost that. Oh, you're going to support drug imports to push down drug prices? Forget that. And what's left is a pile of dust. And then the Republican elephant and the blue dog Democrat said, you're almost there. There's nothing left. Thank you, Obama. This is suggesting that many people saw President Obama all along the way to the Affordable Care Act as making major political concessions and giving in to political pressure, being advised by the Emanuel brothers and many others that you have to get something through. And what he did get through was, in effect, the plan of the HCCU. It was a very powerful coalition, and it was a plan of what's been called minimally invasive reform, reform that will aim at coverage, but will leave as much of the existing healthcare arrangements intact as much as possible. There was a deflection from more dramatic, more coherent, and comprehensive reform in the direction of a plan that fills in gaps and holes according to the priorities of the HCCU. There were two major versions of implementation of the HCCU blueprint. One of those efforts, the first major field trial, you can call it, was the Massachusetts plan, adopted in Massachusetts in 2006. The Massachusetts plan was the basis, the fundamental outline, the basic approach, all the key pieces were there for what became the Affordable Care Act. So let me, in the interest of time, point you to some key places where you can read more about each of those. In She and Sing, there is a useful discussion of the essential features of the Massachusetts plan, which I think when you read them, you'll see how much it reflects and mirrors the HCCU priorities. She and Sing, page 112 on the left, and pages 545 on the right to 546 on the left. She and Sing also point out that the Massachusetts plan bears a very, very strong similarity to the Affordable Care Act when you move from the state to the national level. And there is, in one of these cartoons, the most succinct and clever commentary on that relationship. It's on page 6 on the bottom of the handout that has the cover of the Quest for Health Reform on the front. There you see Romney's, is going to be 2012, running for, or even before that, the presidency. Obamacare is bad, and that's why when I'm president, I will repeal Romneycare. Obamacare. Romney was the governor of Massachusetts when the Massachusetts plan was adopted, and he supported it. He then developed amnesia during the presidential campaign. One of the most clever cartoons in our whole collection is the one on the bottom right, page 6, where there's a little kid who looks remarkably like Barack Obama, it seems to me, and which reads on his T-shirt, Obamacare, and he says, Daddy! And rushes past Obama and jumps into the arms of Mitt Romney because he knows who his daddy is. That is a funny, smart, clever cartoon, and it does capture a lot of what was going on. Now, for details, again, I will primarily refer you to pages in the interest of time. If you want to get a good sense of what the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, was about, in essence, look at Reed. There's some good discussion in Reed, page 164 on the bottom, and then more extensively, pages 244 to 251. She and Singh, more stuff, good analysis, good attentive presentation. She and Singh, page 112, 112, right-hand column, 2, 114, and pages 547 to 548. And some additional material you can glean from the cartoons in that handout that I just referred to with the daddy cartoon on page 6. These are good presentations. And if I had more time, I would go through them in detail, but I think they are succinct and they are clear. If you have any trouble understanding what the authors of these pages are conveying, then please let us know. I think they can be easily explained, but I think most of it is self-explanatory. There were major critics of the Affordable Care Act when it was passed in March 2012. It was introduced in early 2009, I'm sorry, March 2010. There were major efforts all through 2009, extending into early 2010, and then the final run-up in votes and so on, compromises by March 2010 when it passed. Many people thought that the resulting Affordable Care Act was a major, major problem and were quite unhappy with the outcome. And perhaps the best way of seeing that, well, okay, I didn't include that cartoon. That what I'm pointing to is that there are, on page 7 of this handout, even after the Affordable Care Act passed, even after Rahm Emanuel did his really brass knuckle politicking to make sure that the Democrats hung together without a single Republican vote in the House and so on, by a 5-vote majority, which is not very confidence-giving, 217 to 212, there were problems and pushback, and they took the form of legal challenges. So you see on page 7, in the upper left, that's an indication of the major legal challenges originating at the state level. They got to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, in an odd decision that no one predicted, had the generally conservative Justice Roberts as the Chief Justice voting with the 4 liberal justices and creating a 5-4 majority so that the Affordable Care Act passed, with the individual mandate being justified as a tax measure on the constitutional basis that Congress had the right to tax and spend, and since there were penalties attached to not getting health insurance on the Affordable Care Act, that came out of your taxes, and the Internal Revenue Service is the one that oversaw this. It was a tax measure. This was the argument that Roberts came up with, surprised the liberal justices who were arguing on a different basis, but convinced them it was the way to go, and that's how the Affordable Care Act withstood that major constitutional challenge in 2012. There were other major challenges, such as Romney's campaign, and one of the things that that Supreme Court decision did, as you can get from She and Singh and from Reed, is that Another major way that the Affordable Care Act intended to extend insurance coverage was by greatly expanding Medicaid. That measure failed the Supreme Court test. Roberts switched sides, voted with the conservative justices, and in fact 2 of the liberal justices voted with him. So by 7-2, there was a decision saying that the Affordable Care Act extension of Medicaid was a little too coercive. It was left up to the states. They could extend Medicaid if they wanted, but they didn't have to. They shouldn't pay attention to the financial pressures that were put upon them. Those weren't allowed. So as it turns out, only a certain number of the states have expanded Medicaid. 19 have withheld expansion of Medicaid. And the states that withheld are depicted, in effect, their politics in the bottom right-hand corner. They don't need, they're mostly red states. Not all the red states, but there are some red states which have actually expanded it. That's an interesting story that we'll save for later in the semester, the last lecture or 2 in the semester, what's going on there. But the majority of those which refuse the Medicaid expansion were red states, and they say, well, we don't have to worry about that. We have a policy for those poor people without health insurance, the uninsured. We just dump them at the door of the emergency room and hope for the best. And that's what that brilliant cartoon by Nick Anderson captures on the bottom right of page 7 of the handout. I'm going to have to now shift quickly to prepare you for our next unit, which is going to begin on Wednesday. It's going to begin on Wednesday with a conversation right here between Teresa Carroll and myself. I'm essentially going to act as an interviewer at the beginning, ask Teresa some leading questions, and have her tell her story. And then we will open it up to questions from you, anywhere that you would like to take that conversation. Teresa Carroll will get here in a motorized wheelchair. She is quadriplegic. And so she is going to represent for us the beginning of a short but hopefully intense and useful unit on disability and disability politics, which will be the last unit of the course before the final couple of lectures. We're going to try to bring together some of the threads of what's happening with health reform right now as the debates continue and the politics continue. Teresa is going to be one of 3 examples that we will discuss of the sudden onset of disability. As you hear her story, you'll realize that she was an energetic and very engaged young woman of age 17 or 18. She was going to community college in Florida, driving in a car, and some idiot jumped the stop sign or red light, I don't remember which it was, smacked into her and broke her spine. And instantly she became a disabled person. Very dramatic and very moving story of her recovery, attempted recovery as much as possible. But she had become, from a vibrant young 18, 19-year-old young woman to someone with a major life-changing disability for the rest of her life. And you will be able to ask Teresa about that. We're going to look at 3 other examples of the sudden onset of disability. On the syllabus, to coincide with Teresa's visit here, is a video that you can get access to, where you get access to videos from Rush Reese, ground floor. It's called When Billy Broke His Head. And it's a story of a guy called Billy Golfus, who was a radio personality, disc jockey, very live, vivid guy, who had a motorcycle accident. Wasn't wearing a helmet. And sustained a major life-changing brain injury. He fought his way back, just as Teresa fought his way back, but there are still deficits. And another story we'll just read about, if you want to have a chance to see a video, it's about a man called Andrew Goldstein. And his story is told in an article on the syllabus called Bedlam in the Streets. We'll get to the significance of the term bedlam. And it's about a young man, a very, very smart young man in New York City, smart enough to get into Bronx High School of Science, which is You can only go there after competitive admissions exam and real contest with some of the brightest kids in New York. He was one of those kids, and he suddenly was unfortunately facing major psychiatric illness, which had a sudden onset. And that, in fact, is part of the epidemiology of schizophrenia and other major psychiatric illnesses, that they often strike people in their late teens and early 20s, seemingly out of nowhere. And his life was changed. So we want to get his story, too. It's a very vivid newspaper account of that. In order to prepare for Teresa's visit and what else we'll be discussing, I would like you to read certain key pages in She and Sing, to read as many of them as you can before Teresa's visit. Pages are 378 to 387, 389 to 398, and 399 to 408. You might be a little surprised because though they deal with issues that are very important to people with disabilities, a lot of the focus of those pages is on long-term care. But here's the key to that. There is a merger of concerns between those with major disabilities, physical or mental, or both, and the people who have long-term care needs. Because as you'll hear from Teresa, as you'll see in the film on Billy Golfus, as you will understand from the account of Andrew Goldstein, who was the young man in the psychiatric story, people with disabilities have long-term care needs. They are unable, physically, mentally, emotionally, to take care of their own ADLs, activities of daily living. So that's already one major fusion. But it also works the other way. People with long-term care needs often simply age into that situation. When they become of a certain age, because of the loss of physical capacity, or mental capacity, or both, lose the ability to take care of themselves, or all of what they need to do to take care of themselves, measured again in ADLs, activities of daily living. Can they get out of bed themselves? Can they wash themselves? Can they shower themselves? Can they feed themselves? And so on. And as people age, they lose the physical ability, and they lose the mental capacity with Alzheimer's and other conditions of old age to really be able to do that. And so these two very different populations overlap and merge. Those who are born with profound disabilities, who acquire them through sudden horrific turns of fate in life, or have a sudden onset of a disabling mental illness, and those who are leading normal lives through their 60s, 70s, and so on, when they begin to hit the 80s or later 80s or whenever, sometimes before, begin to have major challenges with maintaining their activities of daily living, and also thus age into a population that needs long-term care. So in my presentation, I'm going to merge disabilities, long-term care, assistance with activities of daily living, and I'm going to present them all as representing the other side of medicine. The side of medicine that's not often noticed. The side of medicine that's far away from the glamorous, high-tech, acute care, solve this problem and turn it around, the exciting side of medicine that is so brilliantly successful. But I have to note, with a great deal of sadness, that even that side of medicine fails on occasion. It failed my wife. She died, despite the MRIs, surgeries, and all the rest of the high-tech stuff. High-tech side of medicine, the glamorous side of medicine, can fail utterly and miserably too. And when it succeeds, it gets a lot of credit, justifiable credit, and a lot of public attention. That other side of medicine, though, the long-term care side, the dealing with disability side, the helping people with activities of daily living side, which is becoming an increasingly important part of medicine, doesn't get a lot of attention, doesn't get a lot of respect, because, after all, it's only about caring for people, not curing them. Medicine, nursing, has to be about caring as well as curing. And as my very personal example illustrates, the curing side doesn't always work for all its effort. Okay, Wednesday, I'm bright and early, and I think you'll enjoy meeting Teresa and having a conversation.